We know that the Roman military machina was one of the most sophisticated, professional and well organized of the ancient world. So when we look at the sort of choices that they made when it comes to the equipment of their standing army, then someone cannot help but wonder, why were specific choices made? Now, in this video, of course, we're mostly focusing on helmets, and we're going to compare the sort of legionary helmet and the kind of helmets used by gladiators, and we'll try to understand why the two things weren't interchangeable. Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking. Let's have a look at a few helmets. So when we look at the helmets used by the Roman military, and of course this is a very typical helmet. It's called a Montefortino, and one of the characteristics of this helmet, which was initially used in the we would say mid to late Republic, and then it continued being used also throughout the Empire, even though new helmets were developed, which we will look at in a minute. But one of the characteristics of this helmet is of course the fact that it's light, serviceable, very comfortable. Overall skull of the helmet protects very well everything on the upper part of your head. You do have some form of protection in form of cheek plates, which is a very typical Roman thing that generally speaking we don't see being used even by other powers of the time. It does provide a little bit of protection in the back, but mostly the most important thing that we're going to focus on today is the fact that the face is completely exposed. As centuries go by and we reach the times of the first emperor, Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus Augustus, obviously the military machine keeps evolving, and this sort of helmet, it's a imperial Gallic, typical of the time of the Principate, and then it will have several iterations. So this is a type H to be specific, and what we see is that we have preserved the general protection of the upper part, but we have increased it now because we've got this brim, if you will, which does grant more integral protection. It grants more integrity to the overall structure, because when a blow arrives it won't directly impact the plate of the skull of the helmet, but the force will be dispersed in a thinner, smaller area. The cheek plates remain, and in this case they have become larger, although again this can change depending on the type. One of the main improvements is the back plate, which now extends, which suggests the fact that the back of the neck is an area that needed extra protection, and it makes sense because at the end of the day, when you talk about very close quarter combat, because the Romans are using a big shield and a relatively short sword if compared to later medieval ones, then we can understand how some hits of an opponent who's trying to go through or bypass the protection granted by a massive shield, we can understand how when you're very close someone might start attacking you in the back here. So we understand this, and yet hundreds of years have passed and the Romans still keep the entirety of the face unprotected. Why? I think a very simple yet incorrect answer might be just thinking of technological development. You could think, well, if we look at medieval helmets, whether it be high Middle Ages, whether it be late Middle Ages even more, we see the helmets protect more and more, the protection becomes more integral, and that's obviously because of the fact that we've got heavy shock cavalry, so it's just that the Romans didn't have the tech to do it. This would be incorrect because, as we said at the beginning of the video, just have a look at gladiatorial helmets. If we look at gladiator helmets, and today we're going to look at a few real examples from museums both here in Italy, in Germany and in other places, heavily armored gladiators. So the Romans definitely knew how to do it. Why did they specifically and deliberately choose not to arm the standing army with gladiator helmets that could have provided more protection? Okay, to answer this question properly, let's have a look at a few real examples. So as you know, in 79 AD we have got the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which basically destroyed Pompeii. Pompeii was famous for gladiatorial games, and it did have gladiatorial schools, or ludus. Obviously, as the eruption happened, and we can imagine people tried to save their lives and run for their lives, and that included also the gladiators. So you can imagine the gladiators hear the massive eruption, see people running away, they start running away. And so what do? They just give up on their gear, on their equipment, and they leave it there. And that's why we found some very interesting gladiator helmets. For example, we've got this bronze helmet here, richly decorated, and we can immediately see that again the face is fully covered. But let's learn more about this helmet. Now, this helmet probably belonged to a Thracian type of gladiator, because I do need to remind you that in the gladiatorial games there are lots of different possible types of gladiators or styles of combat. We could even consider them gladiator classes, if you will. When you became a gladiator, you would have to become part of at least one but if you were a very famous one, you could specialize in more. But generally speaking, you would specialize into one type of gladiator, and that would determine your combat style, the weapons you use, the equipment you wear, the armor you wear, and so obviously if you wear a helmet or not. And if you do wear a helmet, then generally speaking, each gladiator type would have its own type of helmet, and we will see why. Now, in this case, as I say, it's a Thracian, which in Latin would be pronounced a Thrax. That would be the pronunciation, Thrax, at least for early imperial times. And this kind of gladiator usually used helmets that were quite similar to another kind of gladiator called Murmillo or Mirmillo, kind of depends, and because there are spelling varies throughout time, but I would go for Murmillo. And that is a very heavily armored kind of gladiator, and usually to become a Murmillo you would have to be a big guy. So it's not just a matter of anyone can become any sort of gladiator. Most likely people who were running these kind of gladiator schools, they would pick and say, oh, look at this guy's big, you're gonna be a Murmillo, and then, you know, train them that way. Although there may be slight decorative differences between the helmet of a Murmillo and the helmet of a Thrax, they generally speaking function the same way. And what we see is that there is an actual development. When we look at the helmet now, we can see it has fully developed visor, but early Thrax and Murmillo helmets were actually different. When we go back into, as far back as we can go, we see that these kind of helmets looked like this. So they had cheek plates and an open face. So basically they were made in a similar way, a bit more complicated, because at the end of the day it is a show. Please remember, it is dangerous, but it's still a show. So helmets need to be elaborate because people need to see them and be like, wow, so cool. You need to entertain the masses. But we can see that they were developed in a similar way to the helmets of the military. Cheek plates, protection for the overall skull, and that's that. But as time progresses, we see that one of the very first development of a gladiator helmet is in fact the protection of the face. And at first it's a solid plate with two small gate-like openings for the eyes only, but then the solid plate is actually replaced, and we see that it has become this typical first century kind of gladiator helmet, which has replaced the eye openings for a full grille. There are many other classes, of course, in gladiatorial combat. You've got the retiarius, both vowels are long, retiarius, which is the kind of gladiator that is very light and quick. They don't wear helmets, but they use both a net and a trident. The very impressive secutor, which is the kind of gladiator that oftentimes, together with the Murmillo, faces the retiarius, because gladiatorial combat was very well organized and planned. There was a sort of balance as well, which makes it very fascinating. Look at the helmet of a secutor. The Secutor has a different helmet from the Thrax and from the Murmillo. The difference in this case is the shape, and obviously the fact that, you know, the opening is kind of different. It only has two small openings for the eyes. Secutor's helmet developed in this smooth and round surfaced helmet because it needs to face specifically the net of the retiarius. So you have to imagine that if you wear a retiarius and you're waiting to know who your opponent is, and generally speaking, unless we're talking about very famous gladiators, then they will tell you. When you will ask, who am I going to fight today, they're going to tell you the name of the person you're going to fight, because, you know, he's famous. But lower grade, lower level gladiatorial combat, names don't mean anything really. So in that case, they will tell you the class. So you're a retiarius and you ask, so who am I fighting today, as you get ready, and they tell you you're fighting Murmillo. So in that case, you would probably be like, oh shit, because it means big guy. But it could be even worse if the answer was you're fighting Secutor, because if you're fighting Secutor, he has got the same kind of weapons of a Murmillo, but his armor is specialized against you. So if it's Secutor, the answer, you would be like, oh, not a Secutor. A Secutor is a nightmare for a retiarius, because with a retiarius you've got a trident, horrible weapon, and then you've got a net. Now the net can be used well against an opponent, and if you throw a net over a Murmillo, the helmet of a Murmillo's got so many spikes and it's got so many brims and all of that kind of elaborate protection that the net can catch onto one of these, and so you have to imagine that the Murmillo might have a difficult time trying to remove the net, and you can take advantage of that and start poking him with the trident. But it's not going to work with a Secutor, because the the helmet of a Secutor is specifically designed to contrast the net. So it's rounded, it's smooth, and so the net arrives and just falls on the ground, unless you're a particularly good retiarius and you manage to do it extremely well. So that's interesting, because it already tells us why the Secutor helmet, as its development, it's just meant for the arena. That helmet, yeah, it looks impressive, but it wouldn't really work very well on a battlefield. If the Roman legionaries used the Secutor helmet, yeah, they could scare their opponents, but at the end of the day, you can't see well, you can't breathe well, you've got solid plate in front of you that prevents air exchange and airflow, you will get overheated, and all that roundness and smooth surfaces, yes, they could be good for having weapons glance off, but at the end of the day, they are specialized against the net, so I don't see it as a good helmet for a Roman legionary. But what about the Murmillo helmet? At the end of the day, you're never going to encounter anyone using a net. Isn't that a good form of protection that could have been used by the legionaries? But the answer is, in this case, I'm going to say probably not. The probably in this case, of course, is based on the fact that the Romans just didn't do it, which already kind of answers our question. If they didn't do it, it probably meant that it wouldn't have been a good idea. These are masters of war. Yes, the full grille is a development that allows and gives better vision. But at the end of the day, how well can you really see? Well, to answer that properly, we need a replica. So eventually, in the future, if I manage to get a replica of a well-made Murmillo helmet, I'll try it, I'll put it on, and I'll let you know. But my guess is you can't really see very well. And most importantly, you can't hear well with all that plate. Now, of course, that can be solved as a problem. You can always create openings on the sides, which is what happened with early Greek helmets. If you see early Corinthians, they are solid, and then they start cutting the round openings for the ears so that you can hear well. And that's the same you've got in Roman helmets, of course. So you could do that. You could modify it and still keep the grille. But you have to imagine that the helmet is made so that it could be used during an arena fight. That's not a battle. It's gonna last a lot less. You need to be able to carry the helmet easily, and that's where the cheek plates actually work very well, because when you've got a helmet with cheek plates, what you do, if you're not in enemy territory, you just do this and you wear it on your bosom. So you nice fresh air as you march. Doing that with a big Gladiator and probably heavier Gladiator helmet, probably not as easy. Airflow is not too bad, or not as bad as that of the Secutor helmet, but I want to say that the Romans saw that, maybe they even tried it on. Some general might have put one on and thought, well, maybe I could use this with my legionaries, but the moment he put it on, he's like, oh, I'm not wearing this. You have to imagine that comfort is important, and fully enclosing helmets, although they do grant a lot of protection, a Roman fully solid plate with eye openings or even a grille plate is never going to be as protective, as comfortable, and as well engineered as an armored from the late medieval period. And even when we go to the late medieval period, we have to imagine that these fully enclosing helmets were mostly used just for combat, and sometimes only for the charge, and even during hand-to-hand combat a lot of knights would just raise up the visor. So the ability to see well, and the ability to breathe, and the ability not to have a heat exhaustion are extremely important. And I think that these three things, together with the ability to hear, were what the Romans wanted. I think, and this is going to be a little bit wrap up of this video, but I believe that if the Roman generals would have noticed, hey, our soldiers are getting too many wounds on the face, we need to solve this, they would have implemented a sort of faceplate. And if you look at Roman cavalry, they do have faceplates. The masks, which are a lot more elaborate, more expensive to make, a lot more expensive to make than a Gladiator grille, and they were used. And I will make a dedicated video to those, and we will talk about why, in my opinion, they weren't used by common infantry. But in general, I don't think a Gladiator helmet could have worked. And the general idea of taking a Roman helmet like this and adding a full grille plate and just leave everything else as is, it would still make it awkward to carry. Unless you make the grille removable, which means comfort, increase comfort, decrease protection, because you know it's then attached through a hinge that could break. If you make the grille just like gladiatorial helmets, then you can't do the little trick that I showed you and wear the helmet when you're not in enemy territory, which again, it's a lot of time if you think about it. When the Roman legionaries were marching to frigging Teutoburg, or they were marching to Gaul, that took loads of time. And imagine, you know, having this helmet always on your head. And again, even if you made it detachable and then you could assemble it before combat, if they didn't, it means that the advantages were less than the disadvantages for the encumbrance, for the fact that you can't see as well. And that's important because you have to imagine that a Roman soldier doesn't fight 1v1. It's a unit. It needs to function as a unit. Centurions have got crests, horizontal crests, and that's how you identify, that's my centurion, so he's leading 80 men, I'm one of those 80 men, I need to understand what he wants me to do. And in the midst of battle, we always imagine the centurion screams like we see in the movies, and everyone understands the command and acts accordingly. But in my experience, whenever I've tried reenacting with my group and we put on armor and we had a centurion and he was screaming, we couldn't hear. I mean, I could hear if I was like right next to him or maybe just right behind him, but as the distance between me and the centurion increases, and when you have 80 men, yes, there is going to be quite a bit of distance between me and him if I'm not right next to him, but I belong to one of the other rows, then I won't be able to hear him. Imagine in the midst of battle. So that's why I think a lot of the clues soldiers were needed to be able to read in order to understand what they were supposed to do were visual, and that hence the crest. So I have no idea what the centurion just said. The optio, which is the, we could say, non-commissioned officer, will repeat it, but I might still not hear it. Most likely I won't hear it. So the way I'm going to obey the commands is because I'm going to look at the centurion, I know what he is, I can see him well, I see what he's starting to do, and I mimic. That's my opinion. In which case, it does even stronger enforce the idea of never mind the grills, because if we give gladiatorial helmets to the legionaries, it's going to be a mess in the midst of battle, and we need to make sure that the unit operates in unison. Now, there are many other types of gladiator. We've got the hoplomachus, we've got the scissor. There are lots of different kinds, and I did make a few videos in the past, a few years ago, about all the different classes, discussing their ways of combat, discussing the sort of weapons and gear and equipment they were using. But these are very old videos. If you want and you're interested in gladiatorial combat and classes, and let me know in the comments, and if I see enough comments, I will make a dedicated video to specifically identify in a more concise and perhaps better made way the different kinds of gladiators that we had in ancient Rome. But this kind of concludes this video for today. It answers, I believe, the question as to why the Romans didn't use gladiator helmets on their legionaries. But if you have other ideas and you've got something else you wanted to add to what I said, or perhaps you don't agree with what I said, let me know in the comments below. It's always nice to have a little bit of a conversation in the comments, and I will see you soon for my next video. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.